What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today's video, we're going to look at how I color grade my videos in Premiere Pro entirely from start to finish. Let's get started. So this is our first clip. Today we're going to look at two clips. It's simply a pan up with the camera. And let's get started with lumetri color. So first off, Sony cameras have a slightly greenish tint. So I'm going to counteract that by adding a slight magenta. Nothing too crazy, maybe around 1.5 would be good. That looks good. Very subtle, you can't really notice it, but it is there, it makes a difference. Up next, this is a slightly flatter color profile, so I'm gonna start off by adding some contrast to it. And after that, I'm gonna crush a little bit of the blacks and also crush the shadows a little bit as well. Normally I would lift up the shadows to get more details, but this specific clip I'm gonna crush it down a little bit to get more contrast out of it. And up next, I'm gonna go to the creative tab. So over here you can add a LUT if you want. You can skip this step, add a custom LUT. For today's example, I'm not gonna add any custom LUT. I'm actually gonna add a built-in LUT from Premiere, which is this one right here. So it gives it a nice look, but I feel like it's too intense. So I'm going to reduce it down to about, I think 50, 54 over here looks good. And I realized that it is a bit too yellowish. So I'm going to add slight blue tint in the shadow area and a yellow in the highlight. Nothing too crazy, very, very subtle. And that's pretty much it for this area. You can adjust the vibrance and saturation of it if you want, but I'm going to leave it as it is because I like the look right now. So we're going to move on to our curves adjustment. I'm going to add a typical very small S curve, very subtle, nothing too crazy because it's starting to have too much contrast. Just a tiny bit. So I'm crushing down the shadows and lifting up the highlights, and that gives it some nice contrast. I'm going to actually reduce the contrast in the basic correction slightly. Right about there. I think that looks pretty good. Now up next, you can color grade from the RGB curves. What I'm going to do is go to the green, and I'm going to start off with a blue actually. And I'm going to add some blue in the shadows, just like I did before, just intensify a little bit, and then remove some from the highlights. So that added more of a green tint, so I'm going to go to the green and do the exact opposite. Just a very small subtle S curve, nothing too crazy. That's starting to look a little too crazy. So the subtle changes. Here's where you can get your look, the look that you're kind of looking for in the RGB curves. So you can see the before and after. Very subtle, but you can see the changes. They are noticeable. And that's what you want. You don't want something too drastic that just looks like an over color graded image. So up next is going to be, I'll show you this HueSaturation curves. This is added in the new Premiere. It wasn't there before, but you can do selective saturation you can do saturation adjustments for selective colors. So for example, I'm going to pick the red here. So the only red we have is in this flag. So if I want to desaturate it, I can simply bring it down or up, and I can saturate or desaturate certain parts of the image. So let's just add a little bit of blue saturation for the sky. Nothing too much, nothing too crazy. Very subtle. I think I like that right there. Maybe a little bit extend it. Just some saturation. And I like that right there. Up next is the color wheels. We're going to leave this as it is, but I'm just going to do one tiny adjustment. I'm going to take down the highlights just so we can get some more details from the highlights area. So as you can see, the before and after, it took down some of the highlights and it lost some of its contrast as well. So what we're going to go back to the basic and give it some more contrast. And that looks pretty good. So we got some detail out of the highlights area, and then counteract that by adding some contrast, because when you remove highlights, you're kind of decontrasting it in a way. Up next is the HSL Secondary. You can use this if you want for it to do selective color adjustments, almost like the selective saturation we just did, but this has more flexibility. So let us pick the red one, for example, again, because it's the only red part in the image, so you can realize it more. We're going to select it and then take this right here. So it's going to show us our selected area. Now this is too small, so it's selecting most of the flag. Right about there is good. The second area is kind of to feather out the selection. So if you want to feather it out, this is what you select, so you don't have harsh corners. So this looks pretty good. I like the selection, and we're gonna remove this so we can see it with the whole image, and you can create the selective adjustments for only the red color. So we can play around with this over here. We can go to this temperature, change that. You can see it made it darker. Same thing with a tint. Once again, same thing. Contrast, sharpen, saturation, all only affecting the red area that we selected. You can create another selection, select some other part, and then target that specifically. For me, I'm going to just make it slightly darker so it's not popping out too much from the image. I think right about there looks good, and I like that. Up next is a vignette. This is really a matter of personal preference. I like to add it sometimes I don't. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to add a little bit. Maybe right around 0.7 looks good. We don't want something too crazy. This really just directs the viewer's attention to the center of the frame. And I really like what that's doing right there. Last but not least, let's just add a crop to it just to make it look more cinematic. That's it right there. That looks pretty epic. Let's look at the before and after. Very cool. I think that's looking really cinematic. Looks like straight out of a movie. At least that's what I think. So let us move on to our next clip right here. This one is a little bit different because we have a subject in it. So we're going to do something a tiny bit different as well. So this is a clip right here. I'm going to stop right here, color grade this specific frame. We're going to start off the same. I like the color temperature. I'm not going to change anything. And once again, this is slightly flat, so I'm going to add some contrast to it. And in this situation, I'm going to lift up the shadows because I want to get more details in contrast to the first clip where I crushed it or brought it down. I'm going to bring down the blacks just a tiny bit. About 4 there is good. And I'm going to increase the saturation to 110. I think that's looking pretty good already. Let's jump to the creative tab. Now, once again, you don't have to use a LUT to color grade. You can simply do it all in this panel. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to use a LUT. And I'm going to use a built-in LUT on purpose because I want to show that you can still get good-looking images through the stock LUTs or not even purchasing any LUTs. But if you do want to buy any, then you can find some pretty epic ones on my website. Link will be in the description below. I'm going to use the same one once again. This is too intense. I'm going to take it down to right about 50%. And we can see that's looking pretty good already. I'm not going to do anything here. I like the way it's looking. But I'm going to go back up. Actually, I'll go back down to the curves. Slightly more contrast through the S curve. Tiny S curve. Nothing too drastic. Nothing too crazy. Right there. That's looking great. Now you can see I've lost a lot of details in the shadows. We'll get back to it. I'm going to lift up the shadows to get those details back. And I think that's looking pretty good. I got all the details. Not all of it. Most of it. And once again, it lost its contrast. We're going to go back and add some more just to get that perfect balance where we have enough contrast but also details in the shadows. So gonna add some here, and let's intensify the S curve just a tad bit. So I'm liking the way this is looking so far. Let's take a look at the before and after real quick. Here's the before, that's the after. That's looking amazing. Very cinematic, don't you think? Alright, so we're done with the color wheels. Let's go to the HSL Secondary. So in this particular one, I'm going to target the red once again. I feel like it's too vibrant, too distracting, and I don't want that. I want this area to be the main area of focus. So I'm going to select it. Make sure this is checked so I can see what I'm selecting. I'm going to increase it right there. Just make sure nothing else is selected. And I'm going to feather it slightly as well. Do the same here. Feather. Trying to get as much as possible without other objects. I think that's looking pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is shift the temperature to the blue. That's going to make it look darker. And I'm also going to desaturate it slightly. Right there looks pretty good. Let's take a look at the before and after. Before, after. Very subtle, nothing crazy. The red is still there. It's just less distracting. I'm going to add a vignette. And in fact, I'm going to add a more drastic vignette here. I like the way that's looking. It is quite a drastic vignette, like I said, but it's not that obvious if you look at it because these areas are dark anyway. So even if I add a drastic vignette, it's not going to show that much. And also, I want to direct the viewer's attention over here, so it is appropriate for this situation. You don't always have to add it. It really just depends on your clip. And I think that's looking pretty good. Maybe reduce it a little bit. So I think that's pretty much it. I like the way this clip is looking, but there is one final step that I want to do, and that is I am going to brighten up his face. I'm going to copy the lumetri and then paste it back here, reset, select it. I want to create a very selective adjustment, and I'm going to pick this frame. I'll create a mask, a circular mask around his face. Drag it on top and then feather it out so we have less harsh edges. I'm going to feather out quite a bit because we don't want to make it seem obvious that we brightened up his face. I'm going to go here, just select this to remove the mask, and let us increase the shadows, slightly increase the exposure. Right about 0.3 I think would be fine. Yep, 0.3. And then add a tiny bit of contrast just so it's not too flat. And I think that's looking good already. Look at the before and after. Very subtle, but it adds a really drastic, it makes, a very drastic difference. Before, after, before, after. I like the way that's looking. Maybe just add a little bit more shadows, just to get some detail in his face so we can see his face. And that is looking pretty good. I like the way that's looking. Pretty epic. One last step you have to do is select the mask and then track it forward so it's staying on his face throughout the frame because it is moving throughout the clip. I'm going to skip that stage. All you have to do is click this, track the selected mask. If at one certain point the mask moves out of his face, all you have to do is go to that and then simply reposition it back here and you're good to go. So one last step I'm going to do is I'm going to add a crop just to make it look super cinematic because I like the way this is looking. That's pretty cool. Now his head's cropped out, so I'm simply going to move the framing down a little bit. And that is looking pretty epic. Let's take a look at the before and after from the beginning. Let's remove everything. That's the color grade. That's the face brightened up, and then the crop bars. Bam, that is looking straight out of a movie once again. Pretty epic, and you don't need any external LUTs, nothing. All this is done in Premiere, just a little bit of time, and that is pretty much it. I hope you guys learned something from this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. It really helps a lot. And if you want to catch future uploads, subscribe down below. That's it for this video, and I'll see you guys next time.